What does Trump's return mean for how we defend ourselves? On this Remembrance weekend, the Chief of the Defence Staff tells us defence must be a priority.
We've been honest in saying that we want to strengthen our armed forces.
And how important is that they need to be strengthened in this dangerous moment?
It's incredibly important.
Russia's neighbours anxiously watch Trump's attitude to Ukraine. We'll hear from Estonia's Prime Minister. But who should cough up? We asked the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, and the new Shadow Foreign Secretary, Priti Patel. And superstar Damian Lewis is here on history's bad boy as he repeats his role in Wolf Hall as Henry VIII.
Take yourself out of the council chamber before I have you taken out. My patience is not infinite, neither with you nor my daughter.
Morning, and on this special Remembrance Sunday, we'll be hearing from Sophie Rayworth at the Cenotaph, who will be with an Afghan veteran. But we can show you the pictures of people beginning to gather for the moving ceremony at the Cenotaph on Whitehall, and there'll be full coverage of that on BBC throughout the day. And welcome to our panel this week, legendary journalist Tina Brown, Lord Peter Mandelson, and also Tory peer and historian, Lord Andrew Roberts. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Let's start, as we always do, with what's making the news. The Sunday Times splashes with a £1 billion warning for Tesco's tax bill after the government's hike to national insurance. The Observer suggests the Chancellor would oppose any Trump tariffs. And the Sunday Mirror and the Sun on Sunday marked the Princess of Wales being back at work, attending a remembrance event last night as she makes a gradual return to work after being treated for cancer. And the BBC's leading on Donald Trump moving closer to a clean sweep of those swing states. After several days of counting, he's set to win Arizona too. And that victory, to all three of you, stronger than anybody had expected. So much to talk about because the world has changed in the last 7 days. I just wonder where all three of you were when you realised the news and what you made of it, Tina.
Well, there was a kind of delayed reaction to the whole thing. I mean, there'd been this flurry that Kamala might suddenly have all these women rushing out. And up until that moment, I think nobody thought it would be anything but a squeaker. And what, of course, was absolutely stunning was just this massive blowout, essentially, for Trump. Nobody saw that one coming, I have to say.
Where were you and what did you think when you heard the ruling?
I got up early and watched it on my computer. I was delighted because I'd taken £100 off my wife in a bet. So my first feeling was a positive one. My sense was that she would have needed to have been, this is Kamala Harris, not my wife, at least 4 or 5 points ahead in most of those swing states to have won, and she wasn't.
And is it the right result, do you think?
Apart from poor old President Zelensky and what he might do in Ukraine, yes, I think it is the right result. I don't think that Kamala Harris would have made a great president, and I don't think he's going to make a historically great president, but he is going to be much better for America.
Peter, what did you think of it?
I thought we were facing a clean sweep.
Which way round?
For Mr. Trump, and that's what we got. And, of course, being Peter, I immediately thought, well, what does this mean for Britain, frankly? And I thought we're going to be in for a fairly transactional roller coaster ride, but that we have to decide how we're going to influence this presidency, what we're going to put into it, and what we're going to get back from it. And that's really what we've got to address now.
So it is the art of the deal.
It really is.
And that was the title, of course, of Trump's famous book. But Tina, you spend a lot of time in America. How do you think he will approach this second time round? I mean, should we believe what he said on the campaign trail?
Well, the huge difference now is he's completely unfettered, absolutely unfettered. I mean, he has every single branch of government, and he's learnt not to have people who push back. You know, so he's now got this tight group of pure sort of Trump loyalists who are going in there very ready. You know, they have been preparing now for the last 4 years. So in that sense, it's going to be much less chaotic, I think, but perhaps sort of slightly more alarming, because a lot of the things I think that Trump says in kind of wild and whirling words, you know, on the stump, he's actually got people who are sort of true believers now. And there's nothing more dangerous, really, than true believers. This new idea of sort of deporting 10 million immigrants, I mean, it feels it's insane, unless, you know, Elon Musk is going to send them all to Mars in a kind of like intergalactic Australia. I don't know how they're going to pull that off.
But Andrew, you believe it is the right result, but should we be alarmed, as Tina suggests, about how Trump looks at the world? I mean, we're going to talk a lot about defence spending today and about the implications for Ukraine, but are you concerned about that?
Well, I think actually the fact that he is president means that we are going to be all putting up defence spending across Europe. I think it happened last time when he was president, and it didn't happen enough when Biden was president, despite the Ukrainian nightmare. And now, if there's a real scare of American isolationism, there is no alternative than to put up defence spending, which is a good thing.
Well,
that is an illustration of where Mr. Trump is not always wrong. He was right about Britain and Europe and our defence spending and how we were going to secure ourselves. We needed to step up then, and we certainly need to do so now.
So we do need to step up now. Well, we're going to talk a lot about that this morning. Interesting that you've put that right there on the agenda at the beginning of the programme, because as we've been discussing, Trump's return comes at a time when we've had politician after politician coming into this studio and telling you and me that the world is becoming a more dangerous place. You'll remember during the election, Labour promised to spend 2.5% of GDP, the size of the whole economy, on defence in order to protect us. But will they tell us when they will keep that vow? You better keep watching. This Remembrance Sunday, the military is foremost in many minds for reasons present and past. And the head of our armed forces, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, stopped by.
I think there are two aspects, really. One is the scale and the significance and reflecting as a nation. So the fact that the King is there, the Prime Minister is there, the former Prime Ministers, but you know that this is an event being replicated all across the country, in villages, in towns, in cities, in all of our nations. And just reflecting on the significance of it in terms of the sacrifice that others have made on our behalf. And then the other aspect for me is responsibility, that their sacrifice was not made in vain. And I think as a military, that's the other act of remembrance that we pay to them every day. And we have over 10,000 people abroad on over 50 operations in over 50 countries and around the globe. And each of those are doing their own act of remembrance by keeping our nation safe, but reflecting that the great sacrifices that were made and what those people achieved, that we protect their achievements every day.
It's a daily tribute in real life being carried out by thousands of people around the world.
Absolutely.
And this has been a very significant year, not just in terms of our one national remembrance weekend. There'll be the huge D-Day commemoration and the anniversary of NATO. There are many different events that you will have attended. Is there one particular moment that sticks in your mind?
So particularly with remembrance, it's D-Day, and I'm really proud in terms of, again, how the nation came together. And the memory for me is at Portsmouth, and it's those veterans and them telling their tales and them reflecting that they survived and quite often their best mate didn't, and how they want us to know, again, that the sacrifice of their best mate and why they all did this. And then the other piece is that it's not just things in the past. At Remembrance this weekend, we're commemorating 10 years from Afghanistan. We will have a particular unit marching past the cenotaph where people aren't with their regiment or their affiliation. They are veterans of the Afghanistan campaign, and they're marching together for the first time as a formed unit reflective of that campaign.
Let's talk then about the here and now. You are the top military figure that oversees the defence for our nation, separate to politics, as you've just said. But since you were last with us here in the studio, the world has got more complicated. The Ukraine war continues, there's conflict raging in the Middle East. Donald Trump has just been re-elected. And many of our leaders, many of our politicians have sat in that chair and told us we are in the most dangerous moment, perhaps for many decades. Are they right, in your view?
Yes, I think they are right. It's the complexity of what's going on. It's the fact that we've got a war in Europe. We've very much got effectively a war in the Middle East. We've got the risk of instability in the Indo-Pacific. And you're seeing a struggle with countries like ourselves that want to adhere to an international system and to an international order, and other countries like Russia challenging that international order, and then much of the world either hedging or not wanting to get involved in that tussle.
What then should our priorities be? Because many people would listen to that kind of explanation, they read how dangerous things are, and many people in the defence world think we are simply not spending enough. And even our Defence Secretary, John Healey, who you'll be working closely with now, has admitted we wouldn't be ready to fight a war. Now, that's a pretty startling admission and doesn't give us much confidence.
Well, particularly on Remembrance Weekend, our servicemen and women will always be ready to fulfil their duty and to serve their country for whatever they're asked to do. What I think we've been clear about is that the world is getting more dangerous and more complex since the end of the Cold War.
But plenty of people who have followed this closely, whether it's Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, or Lord Sedwell, who used to be the Security Advisor and the Cabinet Secretary, there does seem to be a consensus that right now our military has been hollowed out. There's a lot of investment, a lot of armaments that have gone to Ukraine. That means there are shortages here. There aren't enough people being recruited. Do you acknowledge, as things stand, that our capacity is under real pressure?
So I think what's clear is we've been honest in saying that we want to strengthen our armed forces.
And how important is that they need to be strengthened in this dangerous moment?
It's incredibly important, but it's in lots of different ways. So when you think you're in an era which is a little bit more peaceful, you might take risk on your stockpiles, and that might be a sensible thing to do. As it gets more dangerous, you clearly need deeper stockpiles. That's something that we need to do and we're investing in. We also need to learn the lessons of what's happening around the world. So if you look at Ukraine, we need to be better at taking technology and getting it into our armed forces and into the hands of our sailors, soldiers, aviators, so they can use it on the front line in a much more effective and quicker way than we can currently do. That means you also need to have a stronger relationship with industry, and you need to have the capacity in industry to be able to respond. And then the other piece, which is absolutely crucial, is how you blend all of that with your allies and partners.
Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, is also with us on the programme. You may want to decline this, but just to give you the opportunity to give a message to the Treasury's Chief Bean Counter, you'd like more money, wouldn't you, in reality?
So I don't think it will be a surprise to the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, the Defence Secretary, that the Chief of Defence Staff would always want more money for defence. But I think what I could say to the Chief Secretary is that we want to really invest in the mechanism that the government's got to address these issues. That's a defence review alongside a spending review. And the crucial thing for people like me and the other chiefs is that we get things into balance. The ambition of the nation and the Prime Minister against the resources to match that ambition.
Is 2.5% enough?
That's for the review to assess and to do that in a much more significant way than the usual ding-dong of every year, how much money have we got? We want longer-term stability, longer-term clarity.
Let's then talk about Ukraine. Now, Russia's very well known for being very coy and secretive about the true cost to them in terms of their war dead and people who've been injured. But in your view, what is the status quo of what's happening to Russia's troops?
So at the tactical level, Russia is paying an extraordinary price for Putin's illegal invasion. So October was the worst casualty figures for Russia so far. On average, over 1,500 people either killed or wounded every single day.
Every day?
Every single day. And that is for tiny increments of land. There is no doubt that Russia is making tactical territorial gains, and that is putting a pressure on Ukraine, because Ukraine is having to put more people to the front line, and Ukraine is also under pressure from the airborne attacks and the long-range missiles that are impacting on their energy infrastructure, which again hits the morale of the nation. But at the higher level, you then need to come back to Russia. Russia is spending over 40% of its public expenditure now on defence and security. That's more than it spends on education and health combined. That's an enormous drain on Russia as a country.
And yet, from the outside, looking at this, it looks like there is a horrific stalemate going on, where on both sides there are dreadful losses, innocent civilians being caught up in a war, and there is no sign of any breakthrough. But are you suggesting that Putin can't sustain this?
So I'm saying that the longer the war goes on for Russia, the more difficult it is. Russian economy is under pressure. It will be okay this year. It can survive next year. As you look through next year and into 2026, the Russian economy is under more and more pressure. And the Western approach has been to be really clear that Western countries will maintain their support to Ukraine and to do that for as long as it takes. And that's the message that President Putin has to absorb, and that's the reassurance for President Zelensky.
And yet there may be a rupture with that, with President-elect Trump's return to the White House. He said on the campaign, along with lots of other things, that he could end the war in a day. But today, this weekend, Brian Lanza, one of his senior advisors, has said that the goal for the Trump administration will be peace rather than enabling Ukraine to regain territory. Now, I know you've spent years working on this. You're often seen as a conduit between President Zelensky and the US military in particular. Isn't there a deep concern that President Trump may completely switch that approach that you've just talked about, that reassurance for Ukraine?
So it would be wrong for me to reflect on American policy, and particularly about a president-elect, and it's less than a week since the election.
But can you see that Ukraine ever being willing to make compromises?
So again, I think those are conversations and decisions for President Zelensky. We've been really clear that it's President Zelensky and it's the Ukraine people that decide the future for their country. And the UK and other nations have been really consistent in providing the support for President Zelensky.
But last time we spoke, you were standing alongside General Milley, and he is now no longer working for the US administration, and he's become a very strong critic of Donald Trump. He said he was fascist to the core and the most dangerous person to this country. Is Trump dangerous to the UK too?
So it's not for me to comment on a president-elect for the United States. But I mean, what I think I can tell you is that the relationship that we have with America, particularly through the defense lens, is so historic and so strong and so broad. And then we had President Trump previously, and all of that continued then. So I'm cautious about some of the commentaries that are being made as to this will mean X, Y, or Z.
And how vital is it, if you expect it, that America's cash and diplomatic and political support is maintained at current levels to NATO?
It's incredibly important that the world's strongest power, strongest economy continues to fulfill that role as part of NATO. But I also would reflect on the journey that NATO is on. So I talked about it going from 30 nations to 32 nations. Since 2014, NATO spending has increased by over $600 billion, and over $400 billion of that has come from European nations. European nations are already spending more on defence and security and planning to spend even more in the future.
Particularly at this weekend, we're grateful for your time and wish you all the best for the events at the Cenotaph. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Ukraine's fate is not just a political question for the next White House, of course. Russia's other neighbours are watching carefully, nervous of any precedent that might be set. Estonia has a border of about 200 miles long with Russia. If President Trump were to try to force Ukraine to give ground to pursue peace, what effect would that have on them? Kristen Michal is the Estonian Prime Minister.
You don't change the borders by force, and you don't give in to bullies. And I would say the United States and Americans understand very much the fight for freedom, and Ukraine is fighting for rule-based world freedom right now. So I would say this is in United States and Americans' values heart too.
So if President-elect Trump were to try to get President Zelensky to abandon the war and leave some of his own country to Russia, that would be a dreadful mistake, giving in to a bully.
Absolutely, because aggressors' appetite will only grow. Russia will not stop there. And the question probably is that if you start giving up, then you should be prepared to give more. So for Russia, it's quite understandable that if you draw a line somewhere and use a force to back it up, they will back up too, but not by politeness. That's not the plan.
Donald Trump has said, though, that NATO countries in Europe don't spend enough on their own defence. But you're one of the two countries that do spend more as a percentage of GDP on defence than the US. Do you think, given the threats in the world, it is time for other countries to spend more?
Absolutely, absolutely. Everybody should and probably will increase expenditure in Europe to do defense. Not only because of the change in United States, because the problem is Russia, and the problem is Putin. Everybody probably understands that Russia is an existential threat. They have the ideas of enlarging the territory, taking and changing the borders by force. The threats are not only ordinary warfare you can see, because today's threats are much more on hybrid level. Migration is used as a weapon. Different cyber operations are used as a weapon. So the scene has changed. So I would say that the change is what is the basis for increasing the expenditure into defense.
Your predecessor told us before that she was concerned Europe was not taking the lessons of the 30s seriously enough. Do you think that Europe is now taking the threats from Putin's ambitions seriously enough?
I would say yes, right now everybody in Europe is taking it quite seriously. But this is the start. After that, if you take something seriously and you understand that it needs attention and also action, then right now it's time for action. Concrete messages, let's say, on defense expenditure, also on ramping up the defense capabilities in Europe, because if you look at the war in Ukraine, Estonia has committed 0.25% of our GDP of helping to Ukraine to win the war against Russia. And Ukraine is fighting for Europe's freedom, for Europe's values, and also for everybody's freedom. So if every country in Europe would do the same, I would say that the war for Ukraine would be very much winnable in the nearest future.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for speaking to us. It's great to have you on the programme. Well, a very clear message there from the Estonian Prime Minister. And you heard a few moments ago the Chief of the Defence Staff in the UK challenging the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, to match the country's ambition with resources, to use his phrase. Admiral Sir Tony Radakin told us it was incredibly important to strengthen our armed forces. So will the government act? Darren Jones also joined us earlier this morning.
So our promise, as you know from the manifesto, was to reach 2.5%. We didn't set a date in the manifesto for two reasons. The first is that we needed to conduct a strategic defence review, which is happening at the moment and will report in the spring. And the second is because, of course, as with all spending decisions, it has to be subject to wider fiscal considerations. So in terms of where we are now, we're spending 2.3% as a country of the size of the GDP on defence. There was a boost of about £3 billion from the Chancellor in the budget last week. and John Healey, the Defence Secretary, and the reviewers will be reporting with their Strategic Defence Review in the spring.
Well, just on that $3 billion that you raise, the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has pointed out that actually that is topping up money that's going to Ukraine. It's not going into the overall MOD budget. And he said essentially it actually works out as a cut in the overall budget. But just to press you on the date here, we've heard from the Chief of the Defence Staff this morning how important it is to do things like build up our stockpiles again. We've heard from countless experts in this field that we are in an incredibly dangerous moment. So I understand that there are reviews going on, but people want to know, when will you keep your promise?
Well, firstly, I think Ben Wallace is wrong, I think, from what you've said. I mean, the £3 billion uplift to the defence budget was in addition to the £3 billion grant to Ukraine, which continues each and every year in the forecast period. In terms of the money and how it's being spent more broadly, though, the Defence Department spends about £50–60 billion a year, and there's a big question about how that money is being spent and what it's being used to buy. And given that we have donated ammunitions to Ukraine, evidently that money will have to be re-geared towards buying back the capacity and the stockpile that we have as a country. But further money will be announced at a future fiscal event after the Strategic Defence Review.
But your own colleague, John Healey, the Defence Secretary, has said that the military has been hollowed out. The Estonian Prime Minister, who's got Russia staring over his border and an unpredictable American president returning to the White House, says everyone has to pay more. So I'll ask you again, by when will you keep your promise? Can you even commit to doing it in the course of this Parliament by 2029?
So I'm not going to give you a date today because it relies on the outcome of the Strategic Defence Review, which will decide what the spending priorities are.
But you made the promise. You made the promise during the election that you would hit that target. And today, our viewers will hear you're not even committing to doing it by 2029. You might not win the next election. So a commitment without any date at all is no commitment at all.
Well, the promise in the manifesto is a promise that will be met. You'll recognise there was no date set in the manifesto for the reasons I've set out.
But do you mean it will be met in the course of this Parliament by 2029?
As I said, I'm not going to give you a date today because we have to allow the Strategic Defence Review to conclude, which will inform our decisions about how much money we need to spend and what we need to spend it on, given changing geopolitical kind of affairs, but also the state of the defence services as we've inherited them from the last government.
But our viewers will hear this morning that you are not willing to even say that a promise you made in the manifesto will be kept by the end of your term in office.
I think viewers at home will recognise that you have to do these things properly. I can't give you a date today because the Strategic Defence Review has not concluded. That's an independent review being led by experts engaging with stakeholders.
You could commit by what point you are going to meet your promise.
No, because it would be a half-informed answer, and I'm not willing to do that. You have to take these decisions in the most appropriate way. That's what you would expect of a responsible government.
But just to clarify, this is something that you promised in your manifesto.
Yeah.
Is it possible, therefore, by implication, that you will not keep that promise during your term in office by 2029?
So as we've now said for a third time, the manifesto said that we would reach 2.5% of spending on defence spending. It didn't set a date because there was more work that had to be done coming into government. You can't do that work in opposition because of the information being secret. And once the Strategic Defence Review is concluded in the spring and we've concluded the spending review, I'll be happy to come back onto the show and tell you the date at that point.
OK. President-elect Trump's return to the White Office has obviously changed the dial in many, many ways. And one of them has to create a lot of nerves about what he may decide to do or he may try to do to broker an end to the war in Ukraine. Some of his allies have suggested he will push Ukraine to give up territory in order to bring the war to an end. Would that be acceptable?
It's a hypothetical, and as I suspect you might have guessed on a lot of these hypothetical questions about President-elect Trump, it's not for me to comment on hypotheticals. Our commitment to Ukraine as a country here in the United Kingdom, as a government minister today, is resolute. I think people have recognised that. We continue to support Ukraine with billions of pounds of funding every year and support from our armed forces in line with our commitments through NATO. And we'll continue to work with the Biden administration, who remain in post until the end of this calendar year, on making progress to support Ukraine in the way that we've set out.
But in a principled position, plenty of your colleagues have sat in that chair and said it's absolutely vital that President Zelensky's wish to regain his territory is respected. The Estonian Prime Minister has told us to allow Ukraine to push Ukraine to give up territory would be giving in to bullies. Is he wrong?
So the government's position is, as it always has been, which is we are supporting the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people to defend itself, and we do think that Ukraine should be able to recover its country as it was previously structured. There shouldn't be an element of conceding to illegal invasions from Russia, of course. What I'm not willing to comment on is hypothetical scenarios about a future administration in the United States.
But that principle stands that it is the UK's position that Ukraine's desire to get back Crimea, to get back their territory, the UK's position is that that ought to be respected still.
That's the basis on which the UK government is operating.
Do you still think that Donald Trump is repugnant?
Did I say that?
You wrote that a few years ago.
It's
still there online.
Where is it?
It's still there online.
I don't know where that's from.
In a post you wrote online on media. Well, I can read you the quote. I don't physically have it, but I can read you the quote. You said, "In my view, with the US election being so close with a Republican candidate as repugnant as Donald Trump spells a much longer-term problem for the centre-left of politics."
And when was that written?
It was written in 2016 when he was running for election. And then in 2022, you said maybe Donald Trump, Scott Morrison and Boris Johnson can get together and reminisce about the failures of divisive right-wing populism.
Well, look, it's no surprise that as a Labour Party politician, I support Labour sister parties such as the Democrats. All of us have commented on politics in the past, but what's very clear is that President-elect Trump won very decisively in the United States. He won the Electoral College, the popular vote, the Senate, the House of Reps. He has got a mandate from the American people to lead them from the inauguration in January, and as a government, we obviously totally respect that, and we look forward to working with him and his administration.
There is a serious point, though, about there are plenty of people in government who, as you said quite clearly, instinctively, he's not one of your people. Instinctively, there are things that he has said or may believe in that you fundamentally disagree with. And in order to clear the air, as it were, the Conservatives are saying that you should all apologise for things you said in the past, draw a line and then be able to move on. Will you?
I don't think we should be getting into that. I mean, you might want to ask Kemi Badenoch about the many things she said in the past and whether she wants to go through them line by line. What's important is about how you conduct yourself in government. And as government ministers, as you would expect us to say, because it is the right answer, the United States is an important ally of the United Kingdom, and we believe in democracy. And President-elect Trump has been elected democratically with a clear mandate. And so we will obviously work with his administration in the US in the interest of both of our countries and our values.
Would you argue against the US slapping tariffs, import taxes on goods? Because we could all be hit by that, potentially in order of, one estimate was that we could be a £22 billion hit to the economy. What is the government's assessment on how tariffs might hit us, and what preparations are you making in case?
So as the Chancellor will be saying later this week in her Mansion House speech, the government's position is that we support free trade. We think free trade is important both for our own economy but also for the economies of our allies, and is the best route to growth in those economies. That's the position that we would like to be operating in. But again, you're asking me to comment on hypothetical scenarios of a future administration in the United States.
It's pretty important. As a Treasury Minister, would you fight against one of our biggest trading partners putting tariffs on our economy?
Well, look, if that situation were to arise in the future, we would of course have to respond to it. What I can't tell you today is how, because of course that has not become a reality. So we will continue to work with President Biden and his administration until the inauguration.
But what preparations are you making inside government? I mean, there are reports this morning, also I've talked to sources in government who say that government departments are considering this, they are looking at it in order to be prepared. And surely as a Treasury Minister, you're able to comment on that.
Well, it's right that officials consider various different scenarios at all times, whether it's in relation to what's happening in the US or our negotiations with the European Union, in order to be able to advise ministers should situations arise in the future. But those private preparations in order to inform discussions in government is different to being able to comment publicly on
You seem incredibly reluctant to tell us very much this morning, Chief Secretary. The President of France, Macron, has described this as a bigger question, the overall approach that people in Europe take here and on the continent. And he said that the world is made up of herbivores and carnivores. And he said if Europe continues to be a herbivore, then the carnivore will win. Now, of course, he's there hinting at President Trump. He said that the continent should at the very least choose to be omnivores. Are you an omnivore or a herbivore or a carnivore?
Well, I actually try to be vegan, so I'm not sure this analogy worked very well for me personally. I mean, Look, obviously I can't answer some of these hypothetical questions because
that is the question of principle, and President Macron is an elected politician and he's setting out the principle there.
Sure, and as I say, the principle of this government is that free trade is important and that is our starting position. But as a responsible government minister, you'll recognise what I'm not going to do is comment on hypothetical future scenarios. We'll have to deal with those as and when they arise.
But we are looking to an era where there is a president on his way back to the White House who we know already has a different take on the economy. And in this kind of world, perhaps you either eat or get eaten. I mean, is Britain ready for a more aggressive and protectionist American president?
Well, look, it's for President-elect Trump to decide for his own domestic economy how he wants to respond. But I think
are we ready for it? That's the thing people watching at home want to know. Are we ready, whatever he does?
Sure. As I said, officials will be preparing for different outcomes in order to advise ministers as and when they need to in the future. But I would just say that President Trump has said publicly that he values the relationship the United States has with the United Kingdom, recognises the important relationship that we have on security, but also on trade, and would continue to encourage that positive relationship.
Would you go for a trade deal? You hope to get a trade deal this Parliament with the US?
Well, of course, we're in negotiations with the European Union on reducing trade frictions, and that's important for the UK. The US is already one of our most important export partners, as well as in terms of direct investment here into the UK. Of course, we'd be happy to talk about making that better in the future, but we'd have to have that discussion with the new administration in the new year.
Lastly, on the budget, on the decisions that you have made, that I'm sure the ones you can talk about,
yes.
There seems to be a rising concern about the effects the changes you've made to national insurance, increasing costs significantly for employers. And lots of supermarkets are warning that this might not just make it more expensive to hire people, but because of that, it even could push our prices up. The Bank of England warned this week that your budget might put inflation up. There's 200 businesses signing a letter in one of the papers this morning saying you're piling costs onto them. There's a real chorus of criticism developing. Might you rethink this plan?
No. And let's remember why we ended up increasing employer national insurance contributions. We did that because we were very clear we were not going to increase income tax or employee national insurance contributions on workers' pay slips. That's a promise we made at the election. It's a promise that we've honoured. But we did need to raise revenue from tax because of the state of the public finances that we inherited from the last government. But in the way that we designed the employer national insurance scheme, we did do it purposefully in a way that tried to limit the extra cost on small business. And so over 50% of businesses will either pay exactly the same as they did before or less.
So you're purposely piling costs onto big business who hire thousands and thousands of people in this country and who pay tax already in a very significant way. And from what they're saying, the chief exec of M&S, the boss of Asda, there's a suggestion this morning Tesco's tax bill might be up to £1 billion. Nobody said vote Labour for higher prices in the supermarket and lower wages because these businesses can't afford to hire people.
No, but I think the public would recognise that bigger businesses are more able to burden some of the contributions that we need to make to the state, and actually getting the NHS back on its feet so workers who are off sick can get back to work is probably something that retailers will benefit from, as well as all the other measures that we've put forward in the budget. These things have to be paid for, and we've designed a system that protects working people and tries to protect smaller businesses.
So the big business, tough, suck it up.
Well, look, there are measures more broadly in the budget which we think are good for business and good for growth and good for the economy, but on tax contributions, yes, it's been designed in that way.
Okay. Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, thank you very much indeed for being with us in the studio. It's good to have you here. Thank you. Well, what did you think? As ever, you can let us know. Email kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay, or get on WhatsApp 08000 282 161, 08000 282 161. And one of these days, I'll be able to say that number off by heart, but it's there for you on the screen. Let's then get on with our wonderful trio here at the desk who've been listening patiently during those interviews, because our main guests this morning were all heading off to the Cenotaph, so they stopped by a bit earlier with us. Firstly to you, Lord Mandelson, just before we heard from the Chief of the Defence Staff, you said that the government did need to step up on defence spending. So when you hear Darren Jones then not even say, yes, we'll keep our promise by the end of this Parliament, do you think they should be a bit bolder and go a bit further?
I've actually got rather a lot of confidence in Darren Jones. I think he's a very tough sidekick to our Iron Chancellor. And I think when he's ready, he will find the resources to increase the defence budget. But he's right in saying, first of all, that the economy has got to grow in the meantime so that we can afford to do so. But secondly, the Strategic Defence Review has not just got to sort of rewrite and offer a different version of the past. I think our armed forces, NATO, they've all got to go through a period of reinvention for the 21st century. I think that CDS, the Chief of the Defence Staff, was right in saying that we need to diffuse technology, data, digitalisation right across our armed forces. And by the way, if we do that, there are many industrial opportunities, technological opportunities available to us in Britain, but I also think it would form part of the basis of a new economic relationship and future digital and technological economic agreement between ourselves and the United States, which I hope in due course would also embrace the European Union.
A trade deal?
A trade deal, yes, but a different sort of trade deal, not the old-fashioned sort of free trade agreement of sort of goods and mortar, more sort of clicks and portals of the future, I would say, is the sort of trade deal that we need. And I think that given that the United States and the UK are both such advanced digital countries and economies, there's enormous scope here for us to align and to deepen the industrial, economic, trade partnerships between ourselves across the Atlantic. But I also believe that this can and should embrace the European Union. If we can get all of us working together with common trade policies, we will all benefit much more than if we were simply doing so alone or bilaterally.
And in a minute, perhaps we'll ponder whether the next British ambassador to the United States might be able to develop that kind of idea a bit further, Lord Mandelson. But on the question of defence spending, Andrew, are you convinced that the government is actually going to do what they have promised in the manifesto but won't set a date on? And maybe they should go further. If you pick up the phone to anyone in the defence establishment, and they all will say privately, there has to be more money and it's urgent. Yes, you have to think about the future and how the money's spent, but there is an urgent requirement. What do you think?
Well, what a vegan interview that was, for starters. No meat there at all. It's amazing that a minister comes on and undergoes an interview like that and doesn't tell you anything, really.
But he won it with his joke.
He won it with his... Well, I'm assuming that was a joke, but nonetheless. He... 2.3% is clearly not enough. I'm sure that that's what George Robertson is going to conclude with
the former minister who's conducting the review.
Former NATO Secretary-General as well, of course, who's conducting this review. But 2.5% isn't enough either. We've got a situation here where we're trying to fight Cold War II with the same resources as pre-Cold War, and that's absurd. You can't have a only 2.5 days' supply of 155mm shells in this country. That's just not enough. You can't have an army of 70,000, especially if you've got a civil service in the MOD of 63,000, the smallest army we've had since the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, we are in complete cuckoo land when it comes to defence at the moment, and it's got to be much, much higher. It's got to be 3 or more %.
Do you think, Tina, that this is something that Donald Trump will require of allies?
He probably will. I mean, the thing I was struck with was when Admiral Radakin said, you know, that Putin knows that the West are going to be in this as long as it takes. That is absolutely not true because, you know, America is not in any way behind this war in Ukraine at this point. I mean, they don't want to, they think it's a waste of American dollars and treasure to be in Ukraine. And yesterday, you know, Trump tweeted out that he was not going to have in his cabinet Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, who is very much pro-helping Ukraine, or Nikki Haley, ditto. So that was a kind of statement to say, I do not want these pro-Ukraine people, you know, in my cabinet. So, you know, really America's such an unreliable ally at this point, has been for quite a while. You know, also the Admiral was talking about the, you know, the sacrifices in Afghanistan. But, you know, in Bob Woodward's new book, he really makes the point of how Putin watched as this chaotic exit from Afghanistan, leaving everyone behind and just, you know, allowing drones to be killing, Afghan translators and so on who would help the country. I mean, it was an appalling thing, and he watched it. and thought, you know what, there's no staying power here. And it made a difference.
Peter, what does the UK then do in that position if, as Tina suggests, Trump does, metaphorically put up the wall in terms of foreign policy and say, I'm just not getting involved, you can sort it out yourselves?
Well, I don't think there's any chance of that happening.
Really?
None at all.
Why do you say that?
For this reason. I mean, if President Trump were to abandon Europe, abandon NATO, and abandon the international order, the United States, as a result, would lose its allies, it would be less secure, and it would reduce its influence in the rest of the world. It would be a tremendous boon for our long-term strategic rival, where we face the greatest challenge, which is China. They'd be jumping for joy. And of course it would strengthen those who pose the immediate threats to us, who are Russia and Iran. So I really think there's almost zero possibility of President Trump proceeding in that way. But of course, is he happy about Europe's state of defence? No. Is he happy about the state of NATO? No, he isn't. Is he happy about the international order, state of the Union? No, he's not. So he will bring change. I'm not disputing that. I just think it's less likely to be the sort of unilateral isolationist change that some of the more alarmist people are talking about.
Tina, are you an alarmist then? Peter's telling you you're wrong.
I think he's going to try to, obviously he said within 24 hours I will make a deal happen. And the only deal that could happen is Zelensky just giving up his desire to be in NATO and giving up the land that Putin has already taken.
Tina, I think we can navigate a way through this, if I may. Look, whatever happens to the fringes of Ukrainian territory, and in that I don't think anyone should be dictating to the Ukrainians what they do. What is sacrosanct is their freedom. That's not up for grabs. That's not up for negotiation. So we've got to act in a way, together with the United States, to secure Ukraine's freedom and secure its borders so that Russia can't invade again. Now, I think both those things are possible, not by Ukraine joining NATO, but by NATO members offering security guarantees. And I think economically, we can offer a major long-term lifeline to Ukraine by establishing a much better, stronger, deeper economic relationship between Ukraine and the European Union.
Tina,
of the sort, by the way, I started to negotiate when I was Trade Commissioner.
Is that credible, Tina?
I think it's very persuasive, and I hope that you get the chance to talk to Donald Trump about that. I mean, the problem is all of the true believers around Trump, who are much sort of cruder in their outlook. He's going to want a win of some kind in Ukraine, Trump. He's going to want to say, I solved it. So, in that sense, the question is how much Putin will play ball.
And Andrew, as a historian, how much of a kind of junction point, how much of an inflection point do you think this might be?
Oh, it's very important, of course it is, but I don't think we should automatically assume that just because Donald Trump says so, that Zelensky is just going to turn over and end the war. I was in Kyiv.
Or that Putin will.
Or that Putin will, exactly. No, that's true. I was in Kyiv during the war and spoke to them, to ministers and generals about this a lot, and they said, well, it will be harsh and difficult, but we will fight on.
OK, all three of you, thank you very much indeed. We'll be back with you towards the end of the programme. And all of these conversations about the nuts and bolts of defence spending seem perhaps more powerful and more poignant because it is Remembrance Day. There are gatherings right across the country. The biggest event, with nearly 10,000 military veterans, is at the Cenotaph in London. And Sophie Rayworth is there for BBC One.
Well, as thousands of veterans gather in Horse Guards Parade, ready to come out here on Whitehall, I'm here with Mark Harding, who served in the army for 16 years, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, amongst others. Yeah. It is extraordinary, though, isn't it, that you're able to take part in this march past. Tell us why.
Yeah, in 2010 I was shot in the neck in Afghanistan with the 7.62 round, so it shattered my C5, C6 and took the majority of my spinal cord. The consultants told us sort of never walk again, and I've kind of just used what my gran told me about having a positive mind and put that into practice and put my best foot forward.
And you, having been told you would never walk again, I mean, this is the 4th time, isn't it, that you've taken part in this march past. What does it mean to you to be here?
It's a very sort of point day, really, because when I think about my friends I've lost in operations, and then I think about my own situation that I've gone through, it's just about supporting and remembering the people to the left and right, and that's what all the veterans do, really, come down here. It's look after each other.
There are 11 World War II veterans here today that we know of. There are dozens of Afghanistan veterans who are going to be coming for the first time. It takes a lot of courage, doesn't it, to come here for veterans?
It does, yeah. I mean, it brings up a lot of memories from when the places that you served, like Afghanistan or Iraq, and I think you know you've got to be in that right place to sort of come down to do this, because it's quite a powerful event. You know, with the memories of like the lads we've lost, you know, and then also the lads that have been injured. So coming down here, it's sort of like it's good to be around all the lads, because it's like a brotherhood of brothers, really, who look after each other, and it's just an awesome day to remember our mates that we've lost, and also the lads that have been injured.
And you have, having been told that you would never walk again, you've devoted, really, you're doing so much now, aren't you? And you've walked the length and breadth of the country.
Yeah. I mean, last year I became the first disabled person in the world to walk the whole of the UK, despite being reversed over by a van. This year I've just finished a walk from Carlisle to Arnhem to celebrate the 80th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. You know, and it's important that we keep these like wars like Operation Market Garden, Iraq, you know, and Afghanistan alive, because you know we need to sort of like keep it in the main focus of people's thoughts.
Keep telling the stories. Mark Harding, thank you very much for talking to us this morning.
Cheers, thanks.
And right after us on BBC One, the coverage of the national ceremonies gets underway. And the question of defence raises just some of the long list of issues for the Conservative Party, which is under new management. Kemi Badenoch was with us last week, and she picked a familiar face for her shadow Foreign Secretary. And I'm delighted to say she's with us this morning, the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel. Welcome to the studio for the first time, actually. Let's start then with President-elect Trump. He has taken a more isolationist stance than other US presidents. Does that mean, in your view, that European countries, including the UK, have to raise their defence spending?
Well, I think, first of all, we congratulate President-elect Trump for his successful election victory. But I think, importantly, we have to work with the new administration in the White House. Of course, that's in our DNA. We have a special relationship. But I think this government is going to work really hard. It'll have to work super hard now to regain the trust and respect with President-elect Trump, primarily because of the type of disparaging remarks that we've seen from our chief ambassador in the past. But you've asked about the important question of defence spending. My party, when we were last in government, put a roadmap, very clear roadmap about increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. We were clear that that was essential. I know there's a strategic defence review taking place now. I think it's really important that we come together sooner rather than later to make sure that we are spending that amount even more when it comes to defence, because just look at the state of the world. We are living in very insecure times geopolitically, and we do need to step up.
But money is incredibly tight, as you know, and the Conservatives don't want to put up tax, and you're opposing Labour's proposed tax rises to get the money. So what would you cut if you want to spend more on defence?
So it's all about political choices, clearly. We do need a strong economy, first of all, to be investing in our defences, which means we have to have good economic growth forecasts. Now, I know we're not here to talk about the economy, but I think some of the measures that have been put in place, many of them in this budget, are not going to achieve the long-term economic growth that we need. You've asked what we could do. There are things that can be done. Obviously, we laid out a programme previously around looking at changes around literally performance of the civil service, where we could bring in efficiencies, all sorts of changes there. These are serious choices that governments should be looking at, but also looking at doing the detailed work in terms of how you can get more for less out of the state, how you can run a better efficient state, but also in things like procurement. Defence procurement is such a hot potato, and it has been for a long time. But how we can resource our military, our equipment, all this in a much better way.
But do you acknowledge if you want to choose to spend more on defence, you would have to cut elsewhere in order to do that?
I
you don't want to put
actually
taxes
don't.
up?
I don't. I actually do not. I mean, I have been in government and we've all had to make choices previously. I've been in government where we put money in to increase the number of police officers, for example, and by the way, increase pay for, you know, the public sector. These are political choices and you can do this. What I would say, I think it's imperative that this government start signalling now. They've just had the budget. They could have done more in that budget to put the pathway forward for 2.5% of GDP on defence. I would urge them through the defence review that is coming up and the military chiefs will be working on that they find ways in which that money comes forward. There are many ways, Laura, in government to bring forward resources, and I would really urge this government to do that.
Trump's allies have suggested that he will demand Ukraine gives up territory to Russia in order to end the war. As the new Shadow Foreign Secretary, do you think that would be a good idea?
No, of course not. We've been unequivocal as Conservatives in government. Go back to 2 years ago when the conflict started and began. I was in government at the time. We stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, the people of Ukraine. Look at the resources that we have put into Ukraine, both militarily and for the people of Ukraine.
So President Trump is wrong.
What I would say, Laura, what I would say, we don't know. This is speculation. So I think take one step back. Let's be mature about this. We need to have dialogue, and this comes back to having a strong relationship with our closest ally.
But there are a lot of his own remarks on the record. He said he could end the war in a day. He said that Putin could do whatever the hell he liked to NATO allies who weren't paying their way on defence. You know, it's not all speculation.
He hasn't entered the White House yet. It is important that we find a shared way of working to what is a shared issue, a common cause and an issue. We're fighting for defence of Ukraine, freedoms that actually, you know, on a day like Remembrance Sunday, we should not forget the wars that have been fought in the past and the freedoms that we have right now. There are some serious discussions and conversations to be had with the White House going forward. I would urge our government going forward to be constructive in those discussions and also make the case that we champion and stand by Ukraine and the people of Ukraine.
But in those discussions, you as Shadow Foreign Secretary would urge the UK government to make it clear to President Trump it would be a mistake to force Ukraine to give up territory.
We want the right solution for the people of Ukraine and Ukraine. We have to find the right solution working together.
It's interesting, you've said several times that you think this government has to work really, really hard to make good, maybe to make peace with Donald Trump in order to move forward. I just wonder, after the Capitol riots, back in January the 6th, those famous days, you yourself said that Donald Trump's comments directly led to violence and he did very little to de-escalate the situation. Do you want to apologise to him for saying that, as you're urging Labour politicians to do?
Well, I think that was a major situation. I was Home Secretary at the time then, and we were obviously working with our US counterparts on security issues. So, you know, no one wants to see violence after elections.
But do you stand by your comment that Donald Trump's comments directly led to violence?
That was a serious situation at the time. And in fact, I actually met many of the police officers in Washington not long after that who had to deal with the violence that then came about.
And it was really serious, but the point I'm asking you about is you clearly pointed the finger at Donald Trump for stoking that situation.
Well,
do you stand by that?
Times have moved on, because that situation, if you go back and you saw the extent of the violence and effectively undermining of democracy, you saw what happened. Those pictures were pretty stark in terms of what happened. I was there at the time, not long after, with law enforcement and security people that had to work and deal with that situation and bring calm and de-escalate that situation to then bring calm and move that forward.
But do you stand by that? You were clearly very worried about what was happening to democracy in front of our eyes then.
We were absolutely worried at the time. I think those comments, in light of what happened, were absolutely right and fair and relevant. The crucial thing right now, Laura, is that you've asked me about previous comments. The previous comments of our chief diplomat were much more personal and undiplomatic to the President-elect of the United States. And let me just add one other thing. Our relationships, and I have worked with the previous Trump administration, I've had a very strong working relationship on security issues, law enforcement issues, the Five Eyes partnership. I had a very strong relationship. That relationship is built on trust and respect. This government, I suspect, will have to work that much harder to regain trust and respect with the new coming administration.
But is it still your view that Donald Trump is somebody who was, in that moment, a threat to democracy.
Well, in that moment, we saw violence unfold.
But is that still your view? Do you still have that concern about him?
At that particular time, let me just put this into context. No point fast forwarding now and taking quotes into the modern
Well, that's what
context.
you're doing to the Labour Party.
No, I'm not
so
actually.
I'm asking you about
your own
comments.
Well, then has David Lammy apologised for the comments that he's made?
I'm asking whether you still share that.
But
do you still have the view? It's an important point. As you say, January the 6th was an incredibly serious situation.
There was violence and people were hurt. You saw the level of physical violence that took place. That was unacceptable. Any violence of that scale is unacceptable. Anyone that stands up for law enforcement and law and order would say very much the same. So within that context, that was right and that was absolutely appropriate.
Is there anything that Conservatives should learn from Donald Trump, do you think?
I actually believe Donald Trump is very pro the United Kingdom, and we have had a great and strong working relationship with his previous administration. I've already spoken about the working relationship that I had previously. It was strong, and I want those foundations to continue. So to give you one example, just on trade, trade will become much more of a topic going forward. That's inevitable. We delivered an agreement with the state of Texas. There was work that took place. You recall the AUKUS deal, for example. We began the discussions on free trade agreements. We believe in that, and we think that's a strong way in which our two nations can work together. So you've asked about learning lessons of the past and working with Donald Trump. We know that he is very pro-Britain. He stood by us over Brexit. There is a prime opportunity, certainly for my party. We will continue to be as supportive and work with the new administration in America.
And what about...
But also to stand by some of these key values around economic prosperity and security, which actually really bind that special relationship.
And what about lessons for your party, which took a complete hammering in the election in July? What about lessons for you from how he operates politically, how he fought the campaign?
Well, look, I mean, I'm not going to conduct a post-mortem of the general election right now. I actually think there's much more now in terms of going forward about, yes, how you engage, other people that may not have voted for us in this election, but in the way in which Donald Trump was able to bring coalitions in America. And I have to say, all credit to him. Absolute all credit to him in the way in which the naysayers were saying he would not win, he would alienate people. On the contrary, he's brought people of different communities together. And I commend him for that because he's shown strength. He's shown that he wants to bring America together in a constructive way, people of different backgrounds. And that is absolutely something that I believe in this country, and the Conservative Party has always stood by those values and beliefs. We're a party that wants to represent everyone in the United Kingdom and be a force for good for our country at home and abroad.
OK, Priti Patel, it's great to have you with us in the studio for the first time. Now you're back on the front bench. We'll hope to see you again here soon. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Right, that is enough modern day drama. Let's take a breath and indulge in some from the past, because tantrums and tyrants are nothing new. The story of Henry VIII, one of history's bad boys, is back on our screens with the latest adaptation of the epic Hilary Mantel novels of Wolf Hall. The Mirror and the Light starts on BBC One tonight, and Damian Lewis again plays the troubled king.
So I warn you, if I hear so much as one voice raised in support of that errant creature, my daughter, I shall know I am hearing treason.
You will make yourself a monster in the sight of all.
Pardon your old friend's plain speaking, Majesty. We are all overwrought.
Fitzwilliam, take yourself out of the council chamber before I have you taken out. My patience is not infinite, neither with you nor my daughter.
Henry himself is ever more paranoid, worried, disillusioned by the people around him. And the tragic arc, really, of this series is watching Cromwell just slightly lose the Midas touch that he always had. And you just get the sense that the writing is on the wall.
And where does that come from in Henry, having studied the character? Is it just a need to be loved? Is it a sense of frustration? Where does it come from, his bad behaviour?
Well, there are a few things to remember. Henry was never supposed to be king. His brother was king. His brother died young. Henry then ascended to the throne. His father was a miser and a paranoid man. Henry VIII did not start that way, but becomes that. He becomes his dad. Hello. And he becomes increasingly paranoid. They all believed at the time the importance of a male heir. He's not getting one, and he is an illusionist, Henry. He is a man trying to perform a smoke and mirrors trick at all times, that England is a bigger going concern than it actually is. So he's a plate spinner, and he does that very, very effectively by having a man such as Thomas Cromwell do his bidding for him. And Thomas Cromwell is nothing short of an expert in political machinations.
Why do you think it's relevant today now for people watching, apart from the fact that it's a ripping good yarn?
Well, look, you know, I'll have to give an answer that avoids BBC bias rules, but, you know, in 1529, he set up his Reformation Parliament, and it was essentially a way in which every whim of his, every impulse, whatever it was legitimised through the legislative power of Parliament. And that was his Reformation Court, enabled him to separate from Rome, essentially do what he wanted to do. I don't know if that reminds you of anyone currently out there in the political forum, but we've seen what's happened to the Supreme Court in America.
I want to ask you also about your other career, because you've had an incredible acting career, but you've suddenly somehow found the time to start being a part-time pop star. I don't know if we can call it that. What happened? You've even got an album out now.
Old pop star. Essentially, I was a busker. I used to busk a lot. I had a motorbike. I had a tent. I used to go around Europe in the summers, and I used to play on the streets. Me and an acoustic guitar, and I've written an album in that vein.
Hold your hand close to the water, wrapped in fur if it's all the same.
One of your songs that's really stand out to me, and it's called I Want to Grow Old in Paris.
Yeah.
Now, it's a beautiful song.
Yeah.
You've written that it's about a woman you loved who didn't get to live that dream.
Yeah.
You're talking about your late wife.
Yeah, of course I am. Of course I am. Yeah, you don't need to be Sherlock to work that out. Yeah, so you know, a lot of it was influenced by Helen, and yeah, that song in particular is exactly that.
And it's a beautiful.
She grew up. She was a teenager in Paris, so she always wanted to.
And it's a beautiful song. You say you want it to be an inspiring song.
Yeah, well, I hope it is. Yeah, well, music, you know, music does inspire us.
We're talking this weekend as it's Remembrance Sunday. One of the first times many of our viewers will have seen you was during Band of Brothers. Huge hit.
Yeah.
I know it's something you take a particular interest in also, World War history.
Yeah.
What will be in your mind this weekend?
Well, Remembrance Sunday it's an important weekend. Yes, you're right. I did Band of Brothers, and I was asked to go over and unveil a leadership statue that they wanted to be in the name of Major Richard Winters, which is the character I played in Band of Brothers. And Dick was a very humble man, and he said, well, I don't mind there being a leadership statue, but you absolutely can't call it the Dick Winters leadership statue, because there were thousands of brilliant, heroic men who fought, and I don't want to be singled out. So that moment at the end of Band of Brothers where he slightly chokes and you can see him, the water just rising in his eyes, he recounts an anecdote about a young boy who talks to one of his men and says, Grandpa, were you a hero in the war? And he says, no, but I served amongst a company of heroes. And it's the only time I've ever seen Dick ever slightly crack. And it's an amazingly moving moment.
Well, there'll be plenty of moving moments at the Cenotaph this week, but we're really grateful to you for coming into the studio. Thanks. And Wolf Hall is, of course, now all over the BBC on iPlayer and BBC One and all the rest. It's been great to have you with us, Damian. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And The Mirror and the Light does start on BBC One tonight at 9 o'clock, so don't miss it. Now, you three, we've talked about Ukraine, we've talked about Donald Trump, we've talked about how all the shifts seem to be taking place kind of almost all at the same time. And it raises an important question for the UK government in terms of managing all of this. Andrew, about who the next ambassador to Washington is going to be. Who do you think it might be?
Well, obviously, Karen Pierce has done a fantastic job, and she's a great woman. And
the current ambassador.
The current ambassador, and she undertakes all the important duties, such as giving me publishing parties at the residence.
So she throws a good party, does she?
She throws a very good party, I have to say, and I think there's only
sort of ancestral inherited
ancestral duty, a duty of every ambassador. My sense is that the person who would be best to do this would be somebody who maybe had another position like Chancellor of Oxford, where you could raise a lot of money from Americans, for example, and that, I think the two might go together extremely well.
So in case viewers didn't know, Peter Mandelson is actually in the running to be the Chancellor of Oxford University. Tina, just when I mentioned that, you actually started pointing at the gentleman sitting next to you. So who do you think the next ambassador will be?
I definitely am rather hoping that Peter will dust off his dinner jacket and realise, I sort of think we need Peter, because what Brits don't quite understand is that post-Brexit, there is a slight sense that England doesn't matter as much as it did, and that you may be seen as a salesman of a distressed asset who has to slightly, pound the door to get an interview.
I can do better than that.
So I just, think you're going to need to work those rooms very hard in Washington to make people feel that.
Okay. And make it sound like it's a done deal. So
one thing I beg, please don't bang on about the special relationship. That is really retired.
I'm actually more in favour of a new relationship rather than a special one. But look, can I just make the point, if you don't mind? Nobody has spoken to me about this job. So I read about it in the papers, but nobody's actually spoken to me about it. So let's sort of put it to one side.
And in the meantime, fancy it? Because it's interesting today. You've been very clear about what the opportunities are, particularly with trade, to build a new relationship with the US. You used to be the European Trade Commissioner once upon a time. So would you be interested if you were asked?
I would be very interested indeed in giving advice about trade to whoever is appointed. I have to say about our current Foreign Secretary, I must say I think he's shown some pretty shrewd judgment as far as Mr. Trump is concerned, and the way in which he's approached that whole team for a long time. He's invested a lot of time and capital. But can I just say, I'm actually concentrating and focused on something else. I know that people say that William Hague is a heavy hitter from outside the university.
He's also running for the
Oxford
job.
Is the favourite to be Chancellor, elected Chancellor at Oxford. All I would say is that if the university does want a big hitter, then it does have an alternative to look to. But can I just say this also, Laura? I've just spent the last few weeks, I've moved back into my college, St. Catherine's.
In Oxford.
And it just took me back to my time at Oxford as a young, gay student who was struggling with the world of the 1970s. My God, what an open, diverse and confident university Oxford has become now. It's a complete revelation to me.
And that's very thrilling.
OK, and Andrew, just last word to you. I think Peter's rather coyly not said he wants the job or hasn't said he doesn't want the job, but do you think that he'd be good at it?
I think it's a first world problem that I have to decide between Chancellor of Oxford and Ambassador to Washington. He would be good. So would William Hague, though. William Hague is a splendid figure. So I'd be torn were I a Oxford graduate, but I went to Cambridge.
OK, well, I think this is the most high-class, first-world sort of job interview sort of public process that we've ever indulged in on this programme. But you three, thank you so much for your insights this morning. It's been great to have you with us. And, of course, most of all, thank you to you for spending your Sunday morning with us. With Trump on his way back to the White House, I don't think it's the last time we will talk about what his leadership means for keeping us all safe. I'll be on Newscast later with James Cook on BBC Sounds. You can, of course, catch up on iPlayer. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place. But you are going to want to stay with BBC One now for live coverage of the remembrance service at the Cenotaph with Sophie Rayworth. You can see people gathering there in Whitehall as we head towards that moving moment every year, the 2-minute silence. And we will leave you with some images of how people in every corner of the country have been preparing to pay their tributes this weekend.